Just me. A place to be me, where you get to experience life. 'Cause life is a journey, not a guided tour. If you want the rainbow, you have to go through the rain.
Welcome back, guys. Welcome back. Thank you so much for checking back in with us. For the month of May, we are honoring women. And we are doing this by shining light on an uplifting event series entitled Ladies Night Out. Ladies Night Out is an in-person event series organized by the nonprofit organization My Community Resource Center, with the goal of providing information, support, and guidance to individuals and families within Guilford County. My Community Resource Center developed the Ladies Night Out series to support healthy narratives around the dynamic role of women within relationships, families, and within our communities. At the first two Ladies Night Out events, a group of over 30 women gathered and asked 5 male panelists to share their insights on topics that impacted women, healthy relationships, and family dynamics. Within this intimate setting of wine, hors d'oeuvres, and juicy conversation, girls, women were able to ask men to be transparent about topics that included dating, marriage, love languages, communication, and boundaries. And boy, was it juicy and transparent. The male panelists offered valuable feedback to women with the goal of uplifting women in relationships, families, and within our community. Today, we have two organizers and panelists of the Ladies Night Out series, Dale Slaughter and David Buchanan. Both of these gentlemen are licensed mental health professionals and are here to continue this important conversation around the role of women in our community. Over the past 2 weeks, the organizers shared their professional insight around the importance of women's mental wellness, dating, and the potential impacts of COVID-19 on relationships and well-being. Today, we will be asking these male panelists to share their perspective, insight, and advice to women who are married and may or may not be dealing with unresolved stress responses from that lingering aftershock of COVID-19 or other distressing events in their lives. A lot of mental health professionals and psychologists would all agree that COVID-19 can be categorized as a stressful event in our history. Even if you didn't experience the direct exposure to a death, an injury, or a violent incident, we all experienced some component of the pandemic. But this does not mean that we all have post-traumatic stress disorder. While many of us casually use the term PTSD to express their reactions or secondary side effects to stressful events, post-traumatic stress can only be diagnosed if there is the presence of 7 symptoms. While everyone does not fit the criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD, that does not mean that we were not changed by the distressing event. So, with that being said, after the first 12 months turned into 20 months, we all experienced and witnessed some sort of automatic survival-based response. This automatic survival-based response, known as the fight or flight response, allowed us to tap into and perceive threats that may or may not have been there. We all have the ability to experience this, but it can also spill out from ourselves and spill into our immediate relationships, including dating, marriage, and parenthood. So without further ado, and with all that being said, we're going to ask these men their perspectives on how women have been adjusting and can continue to adjust to the aftermath of trauma, stress, and any type of lingering effects of COVID-19. So thank you so much for being here, Dale Slaughter and David Buchanan, our mental health professionals.
All right.
Yes.
Good
What's up,
to be here. Thank you,
everybody?
ma'am.
So the first question that we do want to ask you guys is, from your professional perspective, can you share some of the hardships that women have experienced within their marriage that has drawn them to seek counseling services during the pandemic and or since the pandemic regulations have been lifted?
All right. Appreciate you there, Mr. David. I would tell you, I think the biggest thing as far as marriages is uh first and foremost, I would say thank you for a wonderful healthy measure I have. So nonetheless, um the one thing I've been seeing is just the fact that most women, if they have a trauma within a marriage, they're not addressing it. It's like I'm avoiding it. It's avoidance. All right. Avoiding whether they had only their own personal things happening within their marriage, or um something happened prior to the marriage that they bring it into the marriage, and they're not necessarily addressing that. And so when it comes up, it comes out when you have more stressful situations of motherhood or balancing work and life or whatnot, and it comes out in anger, comes out in different modes in that department. But the biggest thing I've seen is like when you avoid your partner. And when you avoid your partner, then you go possibly find other partners. And you find other partners, then you got affairs going on. So it just escalates from there. So at the end of the day, you don't have loyal marriages. You have more affairs. You have, more side chicks, as they say, quote unquote. And it's just get real nasty, real quick. And so the avoidance of addressing the stress and trauma of my marriage within the pandemic just exploded from within the pandemic, I think. And I guess everything else was masked around that. Well, I can go here, I can go there whenever the pandemic was keeping everybody isolated and away from each other. But at the same time, once you were isolated, you couldn't go anywhere. You were right there with that person. So you had to address those avoidance things and this, that, and the other. So that was pandemic. I let Mr. David speak on whatever he has within the pandemic. But I would tell you within that, there was no more hiding. There was no more running away. You had to address what was in the room, and it was not addressed. So you had imploding and exploding, as I would say it. So I'll leave it at that and let my brother David kind of add to that for him.
Yeah, so I do agree with Mr. Dale in the sense of the avoidance piece. There were, there may have been issues before the pandemic, but then with all of the stressors and all of the other um dynamics that came along with the pandemic, just in terms of safety and security and not knowing and control and all of those other issues really um really highlighted those particular issues that may have been already there. But a couple of other things that I've seen through my experience with working with women and relationships is expectations. I think that there's been a major shift in what I see in regards to expectations within marriages and within relationships just in general. And a lot of times the people that are within that relationship are not on the same page in terms of expectations within the relationship and what they want within the relationship. Another thing, and I know Mr. Dale kind of talked about as well, is the communication piece. Um, COVID-19 and the pandemic really highlighted communication, whether, in a positive way and in a negative way. In a negative way, in the sense of we were isolated more and not able to communicate as much as we did before the pandemic. But also we found other ways to communicate. But within relationships, I've seen breakdowns in communication, just in terms of not expressing how they feel, not just having regular communication. Um, and so I've seen that a lot. And then one of the last things that I've seen, which kind of goes back to the expectations, is, women, please don't get upset at me. But I've seen, and again, this is through my experience, I've seen a lot of women that may not know exactly what they need within the relationship. So
Mm.
so they may be searching more for wants rather than what they need. They may want a man that makes six figures. They may want a man with this and with that. But what they need safety. They need companionship. They need someone that's going to have their back. But again, that kind of goes back to the original statement that I said, just in terms of expectations within the marriage and expectations within relationships.
And Mr. David, thank you so much for sharing that insight. We're not going to get mad at you. That is your perspective and what you have recognized and experienced in doing your work. So all we can do is take this information and receive it and do with it what we can. Ms. Tracy, Ms. Sharina, anything to add?
I think the word is entanglement now, Mr. Dale. Instead of avoidance, I think that word that came out during the pandemic was entanglements you find yourself getting into with that avoidance. But I like how you brought out avoidance. And during the pandemic time, and just with your, either one of you can answer, with your hands-on experience with your population, how much of it was a struggle from a clinician standpoint to give that to share the same tools? Was it received easier, or was it a hesitant because of lack of knowledge? Was it harder on you to help your clients to understand during that time? Because the stress to me was, everybody came in at 100. It's not, they didn't start at 0. You coming in at 100. So what challenges did you guys see? Or how did you help the clients maneuver to that, through that rather?
Yeah. So so that is a great point. I think one of the things that I had to do personally was I had to kind of shift how I worked through my sessions before COVID and after COVID, because back in and Mr. Dale may remember this term, but I think they used to use a term of I think it was a cow crisis of the week. And we would train, whenever a client would come in, they would come in with all of these cows. And so we would try to work through them as quickly as we could to try to get to the issues that was going on. But with COVID-19, I had to allow a lot more leeway because it was so much crisis. It was so many things. It was issues with school. It was issues with virtual learning and the kids being home all day and eating all the food and not cleaning the house and not listening to the teachers when they were when they were on the computers, and just all of these things. And so for me, what I had to do was really allow more time for that, and to really kind of build that connection and allow them to get those stressors off of their plate so that we can get to the rest of the issues. And that really, in my opinion, kind of went against what we may have been formally taught years and years ago, because, they didn't want for, clients and patients to just come in and just talk about events for the week. They wanted to really, get some work done. And so for me, that was the biggest shift, just allowing patients to come in and process more in terms of just the daily stressors before we get into the trauma and we get into the other things.
Yeah, I definitely would agree to that, Mr. David. And at times I think the one thing also we learned was that, our trauma sessions were at a specific amount. I think that amount changed a lot doing what Mr. David expressed. And so also you had to add to that. You had to add things, elements of maybe that session you would focus on one of those things that they're stressing on, and try to bring an educational piece behind it, and just try to give them something that would at least help them with that crisis of the week, that cow or whatnot, and try to give one education piece. But a lot of it, I think I have to stand on is just education, because let's be honest, when you're stressed and when you're angry and you're frustrated, that's an unknown thing to you. And so you have to make some known facts with education and things of that nature to secure a person that is fearful of things they don't and they can't control, like screaming about if your child's going to get on the next call, or try to figure out, how I'm going to pay this or get that done, or food, or what have you. You have to kind of help them secure the knowns before you can start going to more of the trauma, the basic needs being met. I think it was more of a survival period. And once you got them at a place of being secure with getting their needs, then you could probably go into some of the trauma. So
And
that's what I was.
I do want to reflect on what Mr. Dale and Mr. Buchanan expressed. So basically, within COVID, it was like people feel as if they did not have any control, as you all expressed, and it brought a lot of fear of the unknown. So as we're coming out of the COVID, now as women, married women, we want to control everything. And because of that thought process, we find that a lot of hardships that we're presently encountering, we brought on ourselves, or we're bringing on ourselves.
So with that,
Go ahead.
okay. Well, kind of to piggyback off of that point, so with coming out of a very heightened state of arousal with COVID and feeling like we have to be organized and anxious and on 10 majority of the time, from you guys' perspective, how can women effectively kind of communicate their needs and triggers to their partner as they're fostering the understanding and communicating with their partner and fostering that support that they really need? Because sometimes it can come off as I am trying to be controlling, but really it is I need to communicate my needs and my wants in a healthier way. So what are some tips that you can give to women, particularly married women who are maybe in some, may have experienced marriage concerns? What types of tips would you give to them as far as communication?
I would say first and foremost, I'm a big advocate on, first off, recognize it for yourself. If you can't necessarily fully explain it for yourself, what's going on, whether emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, what have you, you can't really define it for yourself. How can you communicate it to your partner? So I would say, first off, you have to make yourself aware of it. Self-awareness, first and foremost. What am I angry at? Am I angry at all these external stimulation, or am I angry with this eternal stimulation that I got going on? And figure that out. Now, if this trauma is going to be something that's triggering you on the external, that actually, perpetuates your internal. So at the end of the day, I need to make that aware for myself, first and foremost. Once I'm aware of that, then I have to communicate that for myself. Communicate it to myself. Write it out. Journal it. Process it. And I would say thirdly, definitely look at the fact that how emotional I am about it. Because if you haven't even recognized how emotional and what emotions are going on for you, then how can you actually control the emotion enough or de-escalate it enough to be able to cognitively function and communicate it and problem solve it? My biggest thing here is when I talk to ladies, any negative emotion, no matter what it is, if it's too high and escalated, biologically, your brain is not going to function to listen and or problem solve. So you have to de-escalate yourself first and foremost. And then you're able to listen, you're able to problem solve. And that's when, the gauging of emotions are very important. Like, how high is this negative emotion? And that's self-regulation right there. So once that is, I think, equipped for that individual woman or man, then you can communicate it to your partner, because you can communicate it to yourself. So I'll stop right there and let Mr. David kind of add on, or you guys can add on to that.
Well, before Mr. David expressed that, also what you expressed is something in trauma-focused treatment. It's called the wise mind. So what I heard you say is that, the emotional piece, when it comes to trying to communicate, if you're in an emotional piece, first you have to get those emotions in perspective. And then the reasonable mind, they will look at the pros and cons as it relates to why you're feeling the way you're feeling. And it will also help you as it relates to how to organize your thoughts as it relates to what the next step would be. And the wise mind will help you make the best decision as it relates to whatever needs to be done regarding communication. So once again, based upon what Mr. Dale says, that is self-awareness, that's self-regulations. But when we look at trauma-focused treatment, the intervention that you just expressed is the wise mind, that really allowing yourself to go through a series of emotions before you speak. Emotional, reasonable, and wise. Now, Mr. David, if you would like to chime in.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. Yeah, well said. I mean, I absolutely agree with both of you all. It's just two things that that I will add, though, that I would like to add. The first one is, you know, even before the self-awareness, I think it's important, and again, this is through my experience, is for the woman to really be in the space to allow herself to be vulnerable. There are a lot of women that I work with, present and in the past, that has really struggled with the vulnerability piece, and it is a uphill battle to communicate if you're not vulnerable with that other person.
Yes.
Um, uh-oh.
Right? Time out, time out, time out.
Yes.
Y'all have to see all the ladies on this interview when he said that, all of our eyebrows just raised all the way up. Vulnerable what? What you talk about, Willis?
Yeah.
How dare you ask us to be vulnerable in a climate like this?
You have to, that vulnerability piece has to be there. And some of the things that allows a woman to be vulnerable is feeling safe. You know, they have to have safety, have to have trust, and they have to have a willingness to express how they feel and know that they're going to be heard. And I think if all four of those things, safety, trust, willingness to communicate, and knowing that they're going to be heard, that brings the vulnerability level down. That destroys the Great Wall of China. That destroys the boundaries and the barriers with vulnerability. But that vulnerability piece has to be handled and has to be checked before the communication can start. And then the other thing that I would add to what Mr. Dale and what Ms. Smith expressed was you have to know your partner as well in terms of their communication style. There are some people that are within a relationship that you can be clear and direct to, that you don't have to worry about filters and you don't have to worry about saying it in a different way so that they can understand it. And then there are other people that you really have to communicate in a different manner. And so I think it's important for the woman as well as the other person within the relationship to really know each other, to know their communication style, to be able to get the best form of communication across. I've worked with some people in relationships that, because as Mr. Dale said, that emotional piece, it's hard for them to communicate face to face because that emotion comes out. So what they'll do is they'll text out a long message to be able to express everything that they're thinking and everything that they're feeling, and that works for them. But then there's some people that may misinterpret the text message, and it hits the fan after that. So you have to communicate face to face with them. But again, a lot of that goes back to knowing your partner and knowing how to communicate what your needs are, what your triggers are, what trauma that you have experienced that they need to know so that, they're not re-triggering those particular things.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So from just to do a synopsis of this conversation, today we talked about women in relationships, particularly marriages, and we talked about how some of heavy stressors can impact how we communicate, the shift in our expectations and communication styles, and our ability to be vulnerable. But if we do practice these things, and if we can work with our partners to practice these things, then a lot of the overwhelming, the avoidance, the stress can further be rectified as we continue to trickle out of the pandemic and into back to healthy relationships. So thank you guys so much for tapping in with us. And I definitely will be looking forward to hearing you guys and seeing you guys with our next episode. Until then, take care of yourself so that we can take care of each other. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Just Me Therapy podcast. If you are seeking further one-on-one diagnoses, interventions, and treatment plans, please consider scheduling an appointment with an individual counselor at Journeys Counseling Center, located in Greensboro, North Carolina. Journeys can be reached at 336-294-1349. The mission of Just Me Therapy podcast is to use authentic conversations to uplift one's mind, body, and soul. The goal of Just Me Therapy is to offer affordable education and insight to individuals who experience financial barriers to accessing individualized behavioral health care services. With that being said, the information, including opinions, advice, and recommendations discussed in this podcast, are intended for individual, informational, and educational purposes only. Such information is not intended to substitute the recommendations of your own licensed therapist or healthcare professional. Although we are licensed behavioral health professionals, we are not your licensed behavioral health professional. As a result, the advice mentioned on this podcast should not replace the recommendations offered by your own qualified health professional.